It was a quiet Sunday evening, the kind when families usually gather to share stories and laughter. But in the small living room of the Harris family, the air was heavy with tension. Ethan sat at the edge of his seat, his hands trembling, his gaze darting nervously between his sister Mia and their father, Robert. The silence stretched thin, like a thread ready to snap. "I need to dig up Mom's grave," Ethan blurted, his voice breaking the stillness like a thunderclap. The room froze. Mia's teacup slipped from her hand, shattering on the wooden floor. Their father looked up from his book, his face pale as if someone had sucked the life out of him. For a moment, no one spoke. The very suggestion was unthinkable. "What did you just say?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. "I said I need to dig up Mom's grave. I have to." The words hung in the air, cold and unsettling. Mia's eyes filled with tears, her voice rising with disbelief. "How could you even say that? How could you think of doing something so wrong? Mom deserves to rest in peace." Robert, usually composed, slammed his book shut and glared at Ethan. "Enough, this has to stop. Whatever's going on in your head, it ends now. Your mother is gone and she deserves to rest." Ethan's voice cracked as he stood, his desperation spilling over. "You don't understand. This isn't just about me, it's about what she told me before she died. Something's wrong and I can't ignore it anymore." Mia's voice broke. "What are you talking about, Ethan? What did she say?" Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding. He could still hear his mother's faint voice in his head, the urgency in her tone. "She made me promise," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said, if something feels wrong, I need to dig up her grave. No matter what." The weight of his words hit like a storm. Mia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, that's not true. She would never say something like that." "She did," Ethan said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "She looked terrified, Mia, and I can't just ignore it. I have to know." Robert's face hardened. "Ethan, this is madness. Whatever your mother said, she wasn't herself near the end. You're letting grief cloud your judgment." Ethan's chest tightened as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. "This isn't grief, Dad. This is something else. Something she was scared of. And if you won't help me, I'll do it alone." The tension in the room was unbearable, each family member battling their own storm of emotions. Ethan's words weren't just shocking, they were impossible to ignore. And as the silence enveloped them once more, the question lingered. What could possibly drive Ethan to such a desperate act? The memory of his mother's last moments haunted Ethan like a shadow that wouldn't leave. She had been weak, her voice faint, but her eyes burned with an intensity he couldn't forget. He sat beside her hospital bed, clutching her frail hand as the steady hum of machines filled the room. She had leaned toward him, her voice trembling but deliberate. "Ethan," she had whispered, her grip surprisingly firm. "Promise me, if something feels wrong, you must dig up my grave." He had stared at her, frozen in disbelief. "Mom, what are you talking about? You need to rest. Don't worry about anything." But her gaze didn't waver. "Promise me, Ethan," she repeated, her voice cracking with urgency. "It's the only way to protect the family." The words sent chills down his spine. Protect the family? From what? He had wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but she had been too weak to continue. Moments later, her hand went limp and the heart monitor flatlined. Her words echoed in his mind louder than the chaos of the nurses rushing into the room. Now, sitting in the dim living room, Ethan clenched his fists. His mother's plea had been clear, and ignoring it felt like betrayal. But how could he explain it to his family without sounding insane? Mia's voice cut through his thoughts. "Ethan, this is ridiculous," she said, pacing the room. "Even if she said that, which I don't believe, how do you know it wasn't just her mind playing tricks on her at the end?" Ethan looked at her, his jaw tight. "Because I know what I felt, Mia." She wasn't confused. She was scared. Robert exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Scared of what? What could possibly make her say something like that? Ethan hesitated. How could he explain the growing sense of dread that had been gnawing at him since her funeral? the strange dreams, the inexplicable feeling that something was wrong. He took a deep breath. "I don't know," he admitted. "But she didn't say it lightly. And I can't just ignore it." Mia threw her hands up in frustration. "And what do you expect to find, Ethan? A message, a clue, this is insane." "I don't know," Ethan snapped, his voice breaking. "I don't know what I'll find, but I have to try." The room fell silent again, the weight of Ethan's conviction hanging in the air. Robert leaned back in his chair, his face grim. "If you do this, Ethan, you're on your own. Don't drag us into this madness." Ethan's heart sank, but he nodded. "Fine," he said quietly. "I'll do it alone." As he stood to leave, a flicker of doubt crossed Mia's face. "Wait," she said softly. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with determination. "I am." Mia hesitated, her gaze shifting to their father. "Then, I'm coming with you." Robert's head snapped up. "Mia, no! This is absurd!" But Mia's jaw was set, her expression resolute. "If he's going to do this, I'm not letting him do it alone." Ethan felt a surge of gratitude, though it was mixed with guilt. He didn't want to drag Mia into this, but her support meant everything. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead, even if it was something they couldn't yet comprehend. The cemetery was quiet, wrapped in an eerie stillness that seemed to amplify every sound. Thick clouds loomed overhead, casting a dull gray light over the rows of gravestones. Ethan and Mia stood side by side, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. Neither spoke, the weight of what they were about to do bearing down on them. The headstone came into view, simple, elegant, and carved with the name Margaret Harris. Fresh flowers from a recent visit lay at its base, a reminder of the love and respect they had always shown their mother. But now they were about to do something that felt unthinkable. Mia shivered, hugging her coat tighter around her. "This feels wrong, Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. So wrong?" Ethan didn't reply. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the grave. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop, to walk away and leave his mother in peace. But her final words echoed in his mind, refusing to be silenced. He had promised her, and he couldn't turn back now. The gravedigger stood a few feet away, leaning on his shovel. He was an older man, wiry and weathered, his expression unreadable. "You sure about this?" he asked, glancing uneasily between Ethan and Mia. "This ain't exactly normal, you know." Ethan nodded, though his hands trembled. "Just do it," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. With a reluctant shrug, the gravedigger got to work. The sound of the shovel piercing the earth was jarring, each scrape and thud cutting through the oppressive silence. Mia flinched at the noise, her eyes darting nervously around the graveyard as if expecting someone to catch them. "This is crazy," she muttered, her voice trembling. "What if someone sees us? What if—" "Then they'll think we've lost our minds," Ethan interrupted, his gaze never leaving the grave. "But I don't care, I need to know." The digging continued, the hole growing deeper with every passing minute. The air felt heavier now, charged with a strange, unexplainable tension. Mia crossed her arms tightly, her breaths shallow. She could feel it too. Something about this wasn't just wrong, it was unnatural. Finally, the shovel struck something solid. The gravedigger paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's it," he said quietly, stepping back. "The coffin." Ethan's stomach churned as he stared down into the grave. The wooden coffin lay buried beneath a thin layer of dirt, its surface worn but intact. He swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Mia grabbed his arm. "Ethan," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't have to do this, please, let's just stop now." Ethan shook his head, his resolve unwavering despite the fear clawing at his chest. "I promised her, Mia. I have to see this through." The gravedigger hesitated, glancing at Ethan one last time. "You're sure?" he asked again, his voice low. "Open it," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. With a nod, the gravedigger pried open the coffin lid. The creak of the wood sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. As the lid came off, Mia let out a soft gasp, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Inside, their mother's body lay undisturbed, her face as peaceful as it had been the day they laid her to rest. But it wasn't the sight of her that froze them in place. It was what lay beside her. There, tucked neatly next to her hands, was a small sealed envelope. Its edges were yellowed with age, but it was intact, as if it had been placed there with great care. Ethan reached for it with trembling hands. He could feel Mia's gaze on him, her breath hitching as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His mother's delicate handwriting filled the page, and as he began to read, his blood turned to ice. "If you're reading this," the letter began, "it means my warning has gone unheeded, and the danger is already near. There is something buried with me, something that must never be found. If it's not here, someone has already taken it. And if that's true, you are all in grave danger." Ethan's hands shook as he read the words aloud. Mia's eyes widened, tears spilling down her cheeks. "What does she mean? What was buried with her?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan stared down at the coffin, his heart racing. Whatever had been buried with their mother, whatever she had been so desperate to hide, it was gone. And now a chilling thought crept into his mind. Who had taken it? And what would they do with it? Ethan sat in the living room later that night, the letter still clutched in his trembling hands. His mind raced with his mother's words, each one cutting deeper than the last. Something buried with me, something dangerous. If it's gone, you are all in grave danger. The phrase repeated endlessly in his head, like a drumbeat he couldn't escape. Mia paced the room, her arms crossed tightly. Her eyes were red from crying, but the disbelief and fear hadn't left her face. "This doesn't make sense," she said, her voice shaking. "What could Mom have buried that was so dangerous? And who could have taken it?" Ethan's father, Robert, sat in his recliner, his face pale and drawn. For a long time he had said nothing, staring at the floor as if the answers might be there. Finally he spoke, his voice low and strained. "Your mother, she had secrets." Mia and Ethan turned to him, their eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. "What do you mean, secrets?" Mia asked, her voice rising. "What are you talking about, Dad?" Robert rubbed his temples, his hands trembling. "She didn't want you to know. She thought she could protect you from it. But I think it's time you knew the truth." Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "The truth about what?" Robert took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for what he was about to say. "Before I met your mother, she was involved with someone, a man who wasn't ordinary. She never told me his name, but she called him the Shadow." His voice dropped, and his gaze grew distant. "He was dangerous, Ethan. Your mother believed he wasn't just a man. He was something darker." Mia's face went pale. "The Shadow?" she whispered. "What does that even mean?" Robert shook his head. "I don't know. Your mother was always vague about it, but she said he made her do things she regretted for the rest of her life. And she said he wouldn't let her go unless she gave him something." Ethan's stomach churned. "Gave him what?" "A family heirloom," Robert said grimly. "Something passed down through her side of the family. She never told me exactly what it was, but she said it was cursed. She believed it had the power to destroy lives." Mia's hands flew to her mouth. "You're saying Mom buried this thing with her? To keep it hidden?" Robert nodded slowly. "She thought it was the only way to protect us. She believed if it stayed with her, the Shadow wouldn't be able to find it." Ethan's mind raced. His mother's fear, her cryptic warnings, the letter in his hands, it all pointed to something far bigger than he had imagined. "But now it's gone," he said, his voice tight. "Someone found it. Someone took it." Robert's face turned grim. "If that's true, then the danger she warned about is very real. Whoever has it, they're playing with something they don't understand." Mia sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. "What do we do, Ethan? How do we stop this?" Ethan clenched his fists, determination flashing in his eyes. "We start by finding out who took it," he said firmly. "If someone's after this artifact, we need to stop them before it's too late." Robert hesitated, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "There's one person who might know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your Uncle Michael." Mia's head snapped up. "Uncle Michael? But we haven't seen him in years." Robert nodded grimly. "He came back into your mother's life about a year before she passed. He knew about the artifact, he always did. I tried to stop him, but I couldn't." Ethan's blood ran cold. The puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was far more terrifying than he had anticipated. "Where is he now?" he asked, his voice firm. "I don't know," Robert admitted. "But if he has the artifact, you're in more danger than you realize." Ethan exchanged a glance with Mia, his heart pounding. They didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. They couldn't ignore this. The truth about their mother, their family, and the artifact was out there, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. The attic was dim and musty, its air thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. Ethan and Mia climbed the narrow stairs, their steps slow and cautious. Their father had told them to search for their mother's journal, a book she had hidden away for years, one that might hold the answers they needed. The single bulb above flickered as Mia reached for the pull chain, casting an uneven light over the cluttered space. Boxes, old furniture, and faded photographs were piled high, each one a relic of the family's past. Ethan scanned the room, his pulse quickening. The weight of their father's words pressed heavily on him. If Uncle Michael had taken the artifact, they needed to understand why and what it truly was. "Do you really think it's here?" Mia whispered, her voice echoing faintly in the quiet space. Ethan nodded. "If Dad's right, Mom would have written everything down. She didn't trust anyone, not even him." Mia's eyes darted nervously around the attic, her unease evident. "I just don't understand why she didn't tell us, why she kept this secret for so long." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't have an answer, and the growing questions gnawed at him like a wound that wouldn't heal. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, pushing aside a stack of boxes to uncover an old wooden chest tucked into the corner. "Here," he said, motioning for Mia to help him. Together they pried open the chest, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside was a collection of old keepsakes, photographs, faded letters, and a few worn books. But at the very bottom lay what they were searching for, a small leather-bound journal. Ethan's hands trembled as he picked it up, the cover soft and worn with age. He opened it to the first page, and his mother's neat handwriting greeted him like a ghost from the past. "I am writing this because I fear I will never have the chance to tell you the truth," it began. "There is something I have kept hidden, something that has haunted me for most of my life. I buried it to protect you, to protect us all. But I know the danger will not stay buried forever." Mia leaned over his shoulder, her breath hitching as she read the words. What does she mean? What danger? Ethan flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning line after line. The journal detailed their mother's encounter with the shadow, how he had come into her life demanding the artifact, and how she had used her final years to keep it hidden. Her words painted a picture of fear and desperation, a life lived in the shadow of a force she couldn't fully comprehend. "The artifact," Ethan said aloud, his voice tense. "She called it a key, not just an object, but something that could unlock something terrible." Mia's face went pale. "Unlock what?" Ethan turned another page, and his mother's words struck him like a blow. "The shadow is not a man. He is a presence, an ancient force tied to the artifact. If the artifact falls into the wrong hands, it will give him power over life and death. I buried it with me because it is the only place he cannot reach." Ethan's grip tightened on the journal. "She knew," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She knew he would come for it." Mia's eyes filled with tears. "But it's gone now. If someone took it, if Michael took it, then we're all in danger," Ethan finished grimly, "and we need to find him before it's too late." The attic felt colder now, as though the weight of their mother's fears had seeped into the very walls. Ethan closed the journal and looked at Mia, his resolve hardening. We need to figure out where Michael is, and we need to stop him, whatever it takes." Mia hesitated but nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "If Mom fought to protect us, then we owe it to her to finish what she started." Together they descended the attic stairs, the journal clutched tightly in Ethan's hands. They didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. Their fight had only just begun. The next day, Ethan and Mia sat in their kitchen, the journal spread open on the table between them. The weight of its words hung heavily in the air. Every line pointed to a truth more terrifying than they had imagined. Their mother had fought against something ancient and dark, something tied to their family for generations. And now that fight had passed to them. Mia traced her fingers over the delicate handwriting, her brow furrowed. "She mentioned Uncle Michael so many times," she said quietly. "He knew about the artifact, he wanted it, but why? What could he possibly gain from something so dangerous?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Power," he said flatly. "If what Mom wrote is true, the artifact isn't just some cursed heirloom. It's a key to controlling the shadow. And if Michael has it, he might think he can use it for his own gain." Mia shivered. "But if Mom was right, it'll destroy him, it'll destroy everything." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's why we have to find him." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Both of them froze, exchanging a nervous glance. They weren't expecting anyone. Ethan stood cautiously and walked to the door, his heart pounding. He opened it to find a courier holding an envelope. "Delivery for Ethan Harris," the man said, handing him the envelope before turning and leaving without another word. Ethan stared at the envelope, his name scrawled across it in bold, messy handwriting. "It's from him," he said, his voice low. Mia stood and moved beside him. "Uncle Michael?" Ethan nodded, tearing the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in hurried, almost frantic strokes. "I know what you're looking for. Come to the old house. It's where it all began." Mia's breath caught. "The old house? Mom's childhood home?" Ethan folded the paper, his hands trembling. "It's a trap," he said, his voice tight. "It has to be." "But what choice do we have?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. "If he has the artifact, we need to stop him. This might be our only chance." Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. The old house had been abandoned for years, left to rot after their mother's family had moved away. It was a place filled with dark memories and unanswered questions. But if Michael was there and if he had the artifact, they couldn't ignore it. "Pack what you need," Ethan said finally, his voice firm. "We leave now." The drive to the old house was quiet, tension thick in the air. The road twisted through dense woods, the sunlight filtering through the trees and fractured beams. Mia stared out the window, her fingers nervously tapping against her knee. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. As they rounded the final bend, the house came into view. It was a large, looming structure, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling from years of neglect. The overgrown yard was choked with weeds and the rusted gate creaked softly in the breeze. Ethan parked the car at the edge of the driveway, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. "This is it," he said quietly, staring at the house. "Stay close." Mia nodded, her face pale but resolute. Together they approached the front door. It was unlocked, the heavy wood swinging open with an eerie creak. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and decay. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they stepped cautiously into the dimly lit hallway. "Uncle Michael?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house came a faint sound, whispering, low and indistinct. Mia gripped Ethan's arm. "Do you hear that?" Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. They followed the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispers grew louder as they approached a door at the end of the hall. A faint light flickered beneath it, casting long, shifting shadows. Ethan reached for the doorknob, his hand shaking. He turned it slowly, pushing the door open. Inside the room stood Uncle Michael, his back to them. The artifact lay on a table in front of him, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The air around it seemed to pulse, heavy with an otherworldly energy. Michael turned slowly, his eyes hollow and his face gaunt. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low and rasping. "It's already too late." Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "What have you done, Michael? What is this?" Michael's lips curled into a cold smile. "This," he said, gesturing to the artifact. "This is power. And now it belongs to me." The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows creeping closer. Ethan could feel the weight of the artifact's presence, the way it seemed to draw everything toward it. His mother's warnings echoed in his mind. The artifact is a key to something terrible. "We're taking it back," Ethan said firmly. "Whatever you think this is, it has to end." Michael laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "You're too late, Ethan. The shadow is awake and you've already lost." The air grew colder and the shadows began to move. The room darkened further, the faint glow of the artifact pulsing like a heartbeat. The shadows stretched and twisted, curling around the edges of the walls like living tendrils. Ethan's breath caught as the air grew colder, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. Beside him, Mia grabbed his arm, her grip trembling. "Michael, stop this!" Ethan shouted, his voice shaking. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Michael turned toward them fully, the artifact clutched in his hands. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow yet gleaming with a sickly light. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The shadow promised power, Ethan. Power beyond anything you could imagine, and now it's mine." "You're being used," Mia cried, her voice breaking. "Don't you see? This isn't power, it's destruction." Michael laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "You think I care about destruction? I've spent my life in the shadow of this family, always overlooked, always forgotten. The artifact changes everything. It will make me unstoppable." As he spoke, the shadows gathered around him, swirling like a storm. The artifact glowed brighter, casting an eerie light that made the room feel even darker. Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Mom sacrificed everything to keep this from happening," he said. "She gave her life to protect us. Don't let her sacrifice be in vain." Michael's expression faltered for a brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But the glow of the artifact intensified, and his resolve hardened. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling with a strange mix of anger and fear. "It's too late. The shadow is already here." The floor beneath them trembled, and the whispers in the air grew louder, deeper, more menacing. Ethan could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent, something that wasn't fully in the room but was breaking through. The artifact pulsed in Michael's hands, its glow turning from a faint light to an overwhelming blaze. "We have to destroy it!" Ethan shouted, turning to Mia. "It's the only way to stop this!" Mia's eyes widened. "But how? It's too powerful!" Ethan's mind raced. His mother's warnings had been clear. The artifact was a key. If they could destroy the key, they could lock away whatever was trying to break through. But the artifact was no ordinary object. Its energy was palpable, radiating danger. "I'll distract him," Ethan said, his voice low and determined. "When I get the chance, you grab it." Mia hesitated, fear flashing in her eyes, but she nodded, her jaw tightening with resolve. "Be careful." Ethan lunged toward Michael, his movements quick and deliberate. Michael staggered back, surprised by the sudden attack. The artifact slipped slightly in his grasp, and Ethan reached for it, his fingers brushing against its surface. The contact sent a jolt of energy through him, cold and searing at the same time. Michael shoved him away with surprising strength, his face contorted with fury. "You can't stop this," he screamed. "The shadow's power is infinite." But Ethan's distraction had worked. In the chaos, Mia darted forward, grabbing the artifact from Michael's hands. The moment she touched it, the room seemed to explode with light and sound. The shadows recoiled, writhing like living creatures in pain. Mia cried out as the artifact burned in her hands, but she held on, her determination unwavering. "Now, Mia!" Ethan shouted. "Destroy it!" With a cry of effort, Mia slammed the artifact against the ground. The glow intensified for one blinding moment, then shattered into a million sparks. The room was filled with a deafening roar, the shadows collapsing into themselves like a retreating tide. The air grew still, and the oppressive weight lifted. Michael collapsed to the floor, his body limp and lifeless. The artifact lay in shattered pieces, its glow extinguished. Ethan and Mia stood in the silence, their breaths heavy, their hearts pounding. "It's over," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with relief. Mia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We did it. We stopped it." But as they looked at the wreckage of the artifact, a chilling thought lingered in the back of their minds. They had won this battle, but the war might not be over. The shadow had been pushed back, but its presence had been real, its power undeniable. For now, though, they had triumphed. They had honored their mother's sacrifice, protected their family, and faced the darkness head-on. Whatever came next, they would face it together.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.